Dr. Solomon Passy, thank you again very, very much for the honor you are giving us to visit the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy again. We're really grateful to you for the tremendous support you've shown us over the years as a member of our advisory board, and it's really an honor to have you back. So thank you very much for coming back to the ICD.
The honor is all mine, and thank you very much for having me for such a long time on the ICD board. I think this is an organization with impressive past and great future, and I'll be very happy to help this future happen sooner rather than later.
Thank you. No, it's always a pleasure to have you here. We'd just love to take the opportunity now to ask you a few questions, primarily about cultural diplomacy and soft power in the European context and beyond. If I may, I'd like to ask the first question. As we all know, the European Union recently was awarded the Nobel Prize, so many really see this as a success story of soft power in its glory. I was just curious, as you see the past of cultural diplomacy during the Cold War and thereafter, what do you predict for the future of cultural diplomacy in the context of EU foreign policy? Will cultural diplomacy play a role in EU foreign policy in the future? And if so, what kind of a role?
You mentioned the Nobel Prize for the European Union, and I really was very happy to see this Nobel Prize given to the European Union. My wife and I had the privilege to be part of the official ceremony in Oslo, to see firsthand how the Nobel Prize was given to the European leaders. We were part of Cisco brainstorming on the future of Cisco and the technologies in the next decade. Indeed, there is a very close link between technologies and democracy, and that's why it was more than appropriate to have such a discussion on the technologies on the margins of the Nobel Prize awarding. Indeed, there were many questions in Europe why the European Union received the Nobel Prize. Why? There are a number of arguments, number of pros and cons. Actually, there is one big answer to this question. After the European Union was formed, we have 67 years in which we do not have major war in Europe. We have never had in the history of Europe a period of so many decades in which we do not have a major war. We used to have local wars, but they are also behind us. Now, this is a historic achievement, and indeed the Nobel Prize Committee made a very encouraging for the rest of the world decision to give this award to the European Union, and so I'm more than pleased to see it. Today, the European Union, with this award in hand, has many more opportunities to influence the peace and the decision-making worldwide, and to help many other places democratize. And I think this is our main international mission at this moment, to help other countries to have what we have today.
And maybe as a follow-up question to that, I mean, as we talk specifically about the role cultural diplomacy would play, Joseph Nye at Harvard University refers to smart power, in the sense this combination of soft and hard power that needs to be used for really, long-term sustainable foreign policy. Secretary of State Clinton recently said in an interview she's playing multi-level chess, in the sense it's a chessboard on a number of different levels simultaneously. As you look at, let's say, the multi-level chessboard of the European Union foreign policy, what level would cultural diplomacy have, and how would that maybe support the other elements of foreign policy that are maybe more hard, whether it's economic or military?
None of these pieces of the puzzle could play a role alone.
Of course.
We need all of them taken together: military, political, economic, cultural diplomacy, and each of them is of a crucial importance for achieving the final goal. So I would say that the cultural diplomacy is equally important in many aspects as the other three parts, which are more visible, I would say.
Okay. I'll let my colleagues have the chance. They wanted to ask a few questions as well.
My question is, how has, according to you, the age of polarization affected the West's ability to engage in thoughtful and strategic foreign policy? And does the role of domestic political concerns have a greater impact on the external relations now than it did in previous times?
You asked me about the European Union. I understand. Okay.
Mostly.
What is most important for the European Union at this moment is that we are on the threshold of becoming something different. We got the Nobel Prize, but this is not the end of the story. We're at the beginning of a new period, of a new phase. Actually, this new period of the European Union started in September last year with the opening of the European Parliament, when the President of the European Commission, Barroso, mentioned something which none before them of this rank dared to mention. He mentioned that the European Union should become a federal entity. The federalization of the European Union is indeed a powerful vehicle for upgrading the European Union. And here I see a great role of the cultural diplomacy, because the hard power has nothing to do with the federalizing of Europe. But the soft power, the cultural diplomacy, can do something that nobody else can do, no other actor can do in this situation. We have still political prejudices to overcome in this genius process, and the cultural diplomacy, I believe, is the most powerful instrument to do so. As soon as, along with working with the European Union to get it a federal entity, it means common policy in energy, common foreign policy, which we still do not have, common defense policy, which we still do not have. But in parallel with this, we have to keep an eye on another very important process. This is a process of obtaining a free trade zone between North America and Europe, or between the United States and the European Union. Both are equally valid. So if we achieve one day the North Atlantic or transatlantic free trade zone, TAFTA, this will be a major achievement which will transform the transatlantic area into a major player on the world scene. We are in a very heavy competition with China, with India, with Brazil, with other emerging, with Turkey, if you wish, with other emerging powers. And if the European Union or the Euro-Atlantic world wants to be a competitive player, we desperately need to go ahead with the free trade agreement between the two parts of the Atlantic.
Thank you.
Across the two parts of the Atlantic.
My question to you concerns the financial crisis, and especially the EU. What do you think are some of the fundamental weaknesses of a common European currency? And second question, how do you think the European Union can resolve the differences between its member countries in order to address these problems?
The magical word which is answer to both questions is federalization. The major drawback of the common currency of the euro is the fact that this currency is controlled from 12 to 16 different capitals. This is not possible to be done. The American dollar is controlled by one capital, by Washington, D.C. So we need much stronger role of the central bank. We need much better coordinated taxation policies between the member states. And once again, we need the European Union to become a unity, to become a real unity as far as financial policies are concerned. Can you imagine to have, let's go to 20 years ago, can you imagine to have the Deutschmark here in Germany, because we're here in Germany, controlled from Bavaria, from Hamburg, from Berlin, and from 3 other of the landers. It was absolutely impossible to imagine, and then Why do you imagine that we can control the euro from 12 or 16 different capitals? This is impossible.
Thank you.
Should I go ahead with mine?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Some experts have said that there's a shift in the prime axis of international relations from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Do you agree with that? And and on a side note, how do you think this will affect NATO and the transatlantic relationship as a whole?
Well, there is indeed stronger interest, stronger American interest into the Pacific area, but I would say that this interest has always existed. Now it is declared in public. So the difference is not that big. In the framework of the globalization, this is not against transatlantic cooperation. On the contrary, it very much supplements the transatlantic cooperation. We're speaking, and it becomes more and more realistic, of having in the transatlantic area new partners from the Asia-Pacific region. We're very much open to establish cooperation, and I would say even more than that, to invite for membership in NATO countries like Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And this will reinforce NATO and transform it into a global actor, which in fact it is. But we need the world recognition that this is the global actor as far as security matters are concerned.
Thank you.
And my questions also will concern security. Is it possible to improve the security paradigm in Western democracies by other means than armed intervention abroad? And do you see a role for cultural diplomacy in fostering understanding between communities that mistrust each other?
It is the cultural diplomacy which will bridge these communities much better than arms. It is very difficult to make bridge through arms. The arms are aimed to keep borders, not to make bridges. And so the cultural diplomacy is the one that throws bridges across the differences. And I have witnessed the efforts of Mark Donfried and his team from the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Israel when they invited me for a meeting with President Peres and a number of representatives of the Arab community in and outside Israel, in Israel and the Palestine territories. I saw Mark trying to build successful bridges between the different communities in this land of millennium-old conflicts. And it works, but it requires passion.
Okay, one more question. Concerning the expanding role of the EU, what do you think are going to be the opportunities and challenges for the EU global relations when it comes to dealing with terrorism? And do you think it is likely that a common defense policy outlining division of labor and role specialization will enhance or impair EU relations in combating such issues?
EU, of course, will have very, very serious role in combating terrorism, but we need two things. The first one is common defense and foreign policy of the European Union. This is something that we don't have. Number two, we need much closer cooperation of the European Union as such with NATO as such. As of today, the cooperation between the European Union and NATO is not satisfactory. Actually, I would say it is awkward because there is a huge overlap between the membership of NATO and the European Union. We have 28 members of the European Union and 27 members of NATO, and 22 or 23 of them are overlapping members. In the same time, if the European Union is consistent, will ask for a separate EU seat on the North Atlantic Council, as we want for EU seat on the United Nations. If we, the European Union, want a separate seat on the United Nations, it is much more logical to ask for the same thing within the Atlantic family, where the overlapping of membership is significant. So this is the main prejudices that we shall have to overcome from the side of the European Union, and stretching an open hand and asking for much closer cooperation with NATO.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me pose the next question then. Some experts have proclaimed a coming shift in the prime axis of international affairs from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Do you agree with this? And how will the coming multi-power world affect NATO and the transatlantic relationship?
I will give you a very simple example how the European Union could be more effective and more efficient and more impressive in its performance in the Pacific. I had the opportunity to visit several times Korea, both North Korea and South Korea. And I realized what huge potential there exists for EU intervention in the democratization of North Korea. What they need in North Korea is, first of all, information. I myself happened to live for 33 years in a communist country, and I know that the basis of dictatorship is lack of information. The information is the killer of any democracy. North Korea is the most isolated country I have ever visited, I have ever seen, I have ever read of. I had the opportunity to know more or less countries like Cuba, Libya, Iran, Burma, but North Korea is by far the most isolated country ever. So, if we as European Union succeed to offer some incentives to the North Korean government in exchange of opening the North Korean society to information which to come from outside, this will be a great support for the democratization of North Korea and a great support to the unification of the Korean Peninsula. And here in Germany, it is very appropriate to talk about unification, because we have this. We have in the past century one unification of Germany, and in the previous century before that we had unification efforts, successful unification efforts in Bulgaria, Soedinение, which the two of you know very well. And so we as Europeans have the duty to export our experience to Korea. Unfortunately, after acquiring this experience in Korea, the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria tried several times to encourage the European leaders to get involved into the unification of Korea, but without any significant result. And I will give you an example of why there is no visible result. Of all major powers worldwide, NATO, United States, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, all of them are in the six-party treaty, six-party talks on Korea. We have Turkey, Greece, we have 17 other important powers under the flag of the United Nations which are present there. The United Nations as such is there. Every major player is there. Australia, for example, is there, but not the European Union. So if we don't involve our foreign policy in such a major world's troubles, this is the biggest and the oldest world conflict which exists, which is the biggest heritage of the Second World War and the Cold War after that. So we don't, if we shy away from getting involved in such conflicts, we shall never become major European power. So this is one example which answers in details your question, which is a deep question with many ramifications, but this is just one aspect which gives a clear picture.
Okay, and then the final question linked to that, at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we observed three main areas or kinds of relationships where cultural diplomacy can be applied. Relationships where you have peaceful relations, two countries that want to work together, two countries at peace. Countries in conflict, where maybe they don't necessarily want to work together, and there's actually some terms of a conflict, either military or other means. Third category would be post-conflict, in the sense, what do you think cultural diplomacy can do in those examples? And maybe just to give a brief answer, what would be your favorite example, or do you have a favorite example of cultural diplomacy that succeeded? And you can pick one of those relationships. You don't have to answer all of them, but where you've seen cultural diplomacy really worked in that particular case. Do you have maybe one or two examples?
There was a very interesting dispute between territorial dispute between Chile and Argentina.
Okay.
Territorial dispute. And the relations between the two countries were in a bad shape, but both Chile and Argentina were wise enough to decide, well, we're not going to on war. For this, let's find a peaceful solution. And they decided to find an arbitrage to offer the solution. Well, they went to Pope John Paul II and told him, look, Pope, we want your wisdom on to arbitrate our dispute. The Pope told them, okay, I'm ready to arbitrate the dispute on one condition. And the condition is that whatever I give you as a solution will not be questioned by the two sides. They said, okay. So the Pope gave them a solution, they accepted it, and the problem was solved. Having said that, I'm coming back to the dispute between Slovenia and Croatia on the equatory of the two countries of demarcation of the equatory of the two countries, which is who is the one to play the role of Pope John Paul II between these two countries? Is this the European Commission? Is this the European Parliament? I'll be very happy to see the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy to play the role and finding the solution on behalf of the two countries.
Okay. We have our work cut out for us then. Dr. Passy, thank you so much for coming. It was an honor to have you back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have to confess that I have never been interviewed by 3 people in the same time. This is a premiere for me.
Okay. Excellent.